Okay. So today's an important day. We're going to talk about suspension, and I think suspension is actually one of the things that people are getting wrong the most on their overland builds. So what we're going to cover today is 5 rules for getting suspension. I could call them maybe the 5 commandments, so you don't end up depressed, sad, and with bad equipment. Okay, on rule number 1, where we're talking about having a plan. The deal here is there's really only 2 reasons you need to have a long-term plan, and it doesn't have to be perfect. You generally need to know what direction you're headed in, and that is because weight is a big deal. When you're shopping for suspension, you need the suspension to be able to account for the amount of consistent load that's gonna be on the vehicle. So if you're gonna add 500 pounds of weight to the vehicle, then you need to add springs and modifications to handle that. And then of course the other one is having a plan on what am I gonna do? Am I gonna go run a bunch of Forest Service trails that really aren't that challenging to drive on? Am I planning on running, something like the Canning Road in Australia? I'm gonna run 1,000 miles of washboard at high speeds. That's something to think about because that generates a lot of heat. So then you need a different type of shock. You need to understand what you're getting into, and then you need to go after that purpose-built truck. Rule number 2, end up with a better suspension system than the one that was driven off the lot when that vehicle was new. People underestimate how good the suspension is that comes on these vehicles, and they underestimate the amount of engineering that went into making sure that those components will work perfectly in concert with the rest of the vehicle. Now, I upgraded my suspension on my last 2 vehicles, literally straight off the lot, upgraded them. But the deal there is, again, I had a goal in mind, I had my plan, and I knew why I was doing it. But the deal is, I see people all the time that are buying a truck, and then they're sticking a 3-inch to 6-inch lift on it to be able to stick bigger tires on it, and they're literally putting in a system that is cheaper shocks and worse equipment than what the vehicle came with. Okay, rule number 3, avoid the things like the pucks, the ready lift, aluminum spacer that goes into the top of your shock just to shift it down to get those extra inches. Avoid even the leveling kits. Leveling kits are really popular if you're just gonna level your vehicle and that's all you're ever gonna do. But if you're going to upgrade your suspension, get a suspension system that allows for you to not have to have a leveling kit in there. Use the adjustability of the suspension system to get the level vehicle that you want to get. Use a thing called preload on the shocks to be able to adjust it and fine tune it in. You want to be doing that because that shock was made to be bolted directly into your actual vehicle, not on these spacers, pucks. And whatever you do, avoid body lifts at all costs. Those are a terrible idea. Okay, so rule number 4, on the closer you are to the ground, the more likely you are to stay on the ground. The thing with overlanding is we're not really supposed to be building SEMA trucks. I know that overland vehicles get into SEMA, but the deal is these are not supposed to be monster trucks. And there is the problem of just gravity, weight shift. The higher you get, in a lot of ways, the more problems you can have. Rollovers happen more often than people think, and it's not because they were rock crawling up a waterfall. I've seen a lot of rollovers on dirt roads where people just take a turn too fast, slide a little bit. That happens all the time. They overcorrect, and on a lower vehicle with a low center of gravity, it's no big deal. Correct? Slide right back into your lane and you're good to go. On a vehicle that's way too top heavy with too much lift, these vehicles many times end up rolling. And that's definitely something that's gonna ruin your trip. If you really truly intend to build a purpose-built truck that's purpose is to go overlanding and to be reliable, you want as low of a lift as possible that you can get away with doing the things that you want to do. Okay, another important thing about suspension height. One reason why I always advise people to go as low as you can go and still get what you need is that when you go over a certain range on vehicles, you start to have to do drastically more modifications to accommodate that. I'll give you a perfect example. On my Tundra, I can go up to about a 3-inch lift and I don't have to change out my upper control arms. Or you'll hear them called UCAs a lot. If I go over 3 inches of lift. I actually have to put in aftermarket UCAs to be able to keep my wheels in alignment. On a 4Runner, for example, it was about a 2.5 inch. By the time you go to a 3-inch lift, you actually did need to put in aftermarket upper control arms. And there's a little bit of give and take there, and there's a little bit of tuning and flex to play with there. But the thing that you kind of need to understand is once you go above 3 inches on a suspension lift, you're probably going to be changing out your upper control arms for an aftermarket set. You're also likely going to be doing what's called a diff drop. Your differential in the front of your vehicle is what is going to be running the axles out to your actual tires, your CVs. What happens is, as you keep lifting the vehicle, those are hanging down already at an angle like this, and they start hanging farther and farther and farther, and they will hang too far, and you will have to do what's called a diff drop. Now, the thing that I think is so funny about a diff drop is you actually drop this box that all that stuff is tied into down. So what happens is you stick a bigger lift and bigger tires on your vehicle, yet the thing that can actually drag and get caught in the middle of your vehicle has to be lowered. So, you know, people are doing a 6-inch lift and then they're lowering their differential 3 inches. You didn't really increase your, actual clearance by any more than 3 inches. The only thing that probably helped you out there was actually your tire size. If you're increasing your tire size drastically, that tire size is actually, in a lot of ways, the only true lift that you're putting once you're adding in that diff drop. Now, the thing is, you can actually have a very capable vehicle for off-roading and even mild to medium level rock crawling working with a 3-inch lift. You'd want to pair it with some bigger tires. So, for example, if you're debating between a 3 and a 4-inch lift, I would go with the 3-inch lift, and I would go with a bigger tire. If the bigger tire doesn't fit, the amount of modifications that you have to do to fit a bigger tire many times is going to be less than what you're going to have to do if you're doing an entire diff drop and everything else. And then rule number 5 is to actually follow all the rules. I know that sounds dumb, sounds like a joke, but the problem is we start to cut corners sometimes and convince ourselves that that's not as important or this isn't important. No, all these are important and they all work together, and you actually do need to follow all of them, or you very likely can end up with a suspension lift that you're going to regret later on and probably just going to end up spending money twice. Okay, so now that we've kind of dove into the weeds a little bit on some of these components, talking about 3 inches versus 4 inches and UCAs and diff drops, let's cover a couple quick things. On my Tundra, I put in the Old Man Emu BP51 suspension kit that comes with coilovers in the front with remote reservoirs. It's a bypass system, so it's amazing. It basically never bottoms out, even without having bump stops installed. And it's also an adjustable shock, so you can adjust the performance for different styles of terrain that you drive on just with a little spanner wrench, and it takes a couple minutes, no big deal. That's a great lift kit, but when I put it on, if I'd had to put that on and put on new UCAs, maybe that would have eaten into my budget, and then maybe I would have went with the cheaper lift kit. If you're in that situation, and you can get away with using your stock UCAs, even though I get that they don't look very cool, get the better lift kit. Invest in the better suspension, right? If you can afford to do both at the same time, that's probably wise. If you're going to get in there and take all that stuff apart, you might as well do it all at the same time, as long as you can afford it. But don't sub out your UCAs if you don't have to, and let that hit your budget. Spend the most money that you can on a quality suspension system. There's makers like Icon, and they have their stage 1 all the way through, I think, 9 now. You have Kings, they have a whole bunch of different options. They have single bypass, double bypass, they even have triple bypass systems. That's gonna be a lot of money. But, and then Old Man Emu, never underestimate these guys. These are the old dogs on the block that have been doing it basically as long as anyone. They make an incredibly quality product, and you don't actually have to pay quite as much of a premium for their brand name as you do for like Icon and Kings. Let's also talk about some of the other components that you're going to be working with when you're swapping out your suspension. So you're going to have things like coilovers. I can show you what this looks like. So this is a coilover. You can tell because you have a shock inside, you have a coil on the outside. A lot of the coilovers, you're going to have different options for springs to help adjust for the weight that you're going to add to your vehicle. So are you going to be constantly under 500 additional pounds of weight? 100. You can use these springs to do that. The aftermarket ones, a lot of time, you know how I was talking about people stuff a puck in here to make a higher lift? The aftermarket ones are gonna be threaded here, and it's gonna be huge. It's gonna be about that thick. I'll show you a picture of it in a second. And they are, you have this thing called preload on your spring. And you can use that preload on your spring to dial in how many inches your lift is actually gonna be to fine tune it. I'll show a couple other things. A couple other components that you're gonna see. Coilovers are gonna be very popular for overland vehicles in the front when you have independent suspension. Remote reservoirs. That was like when I was talking about when you're doing 1,000 miles on the Canning Road in Australia and your shock is overheating and then the performance of it drops and it wears out too quick. This here is actually one of those Old Man Emu BP51 shocks. You can see how much bigger the shock body is than this. This was the factory. And that is the Old Man Emu. It's also made out of a lot higher grade materials. So this has a remote reservoir that's going to be buckled up here out of the way. This allows your fluids to move back and forth. It helps with cooling so you don't end up with that bad performance from too much heat. You'll see this on both front and rears many times on the shocks on a good set. You don't have to have this. You know, it really is. If your shocks have to be working overtime constantly, that's not gonna happen on a normal paved road. That's not even gonna happen on a normal dirt road. It's gonna happen in washboard, it's gonna happen in desert racing, it's gonna be happening when you're driving hours and hours on bumpy roads. Another cool thing about a lot of aftermarket shocks, you will be able to notice, is they're adjustable by you. So depending on the terrain that you're gonna be driving on, you can actually hop out with a little spanner wrench that clicks on here and change the compression and the rebound to give yourself a more comfortable ride when you're cruising around out there. You got to play around with this a little bit with your own vehicle to figure out the settings that you like, but once you kind of get it dialed in, you kind of know, like, hey, for washboard I put it at this, for regular driving I put it at that. Get it dialed in pretty quick. Another cool thing about these shocks is these are, when you get moving into a lot of the upgraded shocks, a lot of them are rebuildable, so you don't just wear them out and throw them away. You actually wear them out, you can rebuild this and then reuse it just like it's basically a brand new shock. And that's what's gonna happen to this one. As you can see, this one, there's a lot of fluid up here. This one actually sprung a leak in a seal right here. And that's gonna be easy to rebuild, no big deal. I can throw this back on the truck and run it for another, I don't know, 20, 30,000 miles probably. So yeah, that's a perfect example of like an aftermarket upgraded system. Adjustability, reserve tanks. This is a single bypass shock that allows you to really basically almost never bottom it out. I've never bottomed it out. And I've done some pretty crazy stuff. So yeah, it's a great example of an aftermarket shock right there. Let's also talk about leaf springs. So leaf springs is what's going to be on the back of a truck a lot of times. And it's going to be on a solid axle. Some of the older vehicles, you're going to see solid axles in the front and in the rear. Mostly with overlanding, people are using newish vehicles. But with the leaf springs, it's on the back, that shock doesn't have a spring on it, you notice, like the coilover. What that means is the shock is there and you have to handle the addition or subtraction of weight with the leaf spring. So if you add a heavy bumper and a tent and all that stuff, you should be putting in a more heavy duty leaf spring. This is where I screwed up a long time ago when I first put in a suspension system. I didn't account for how much, gear I was eventually going to be loading on the truck, and I went with too light duty of a leaf spring, and I ended up having to fix that later on. One way that people offset that is that you can go to like Toytech. I'll leave a link in the description. Toytech has an add a leaf kit to where you can add a leaf a lot of times to the leaf springs that you already have, so you're not even buying a whole new system. One thing I do love about this, and I'm not sponsored by these guys at all, they don't even know who I am. This Old Man Emu kit right here actually comes with coilovers and remote reservoirs for the front, comes with shocks with coilovers for the back. All of them are adjustable, and then it comes with a whole entire new leaf spring kit. The Dakar leaf springs from Old Man Emu, and they have a medium duty and they have a heavy duty. In most cases, if you're going to be adding tents and stuff like that, you should be springing for the heavy duty kit. So that's kind of leaf springs. One last thing I'll tell you is if you happen to be in a situation where you run a truck and then you also happen to tow every once in a while, especially if you're towing stuff that's really heavy, you have that problem of, well, you have the continuous amount of weight that you normally drive around in that you should be adjusting for on your suspension system. But then when you tow, you add a whole bunch more weight, and depending on how much that is, you will see people put in airbags. Now, the problem with airbags is they affect the amount of articulation that your axle in the rear of your vehicle can do. But what they're amazing for is when you add all that extra weight and then all of a sudden you sag and you lose a lot of your travel on your suspension, you put in an airbag in there, it blows it up, holds it up, still allows you to use your suspension. So they're pretty amazing for people that are gonna tow a lot, but I really wouldn't recommend it if you're going to be doing like gnarly Moab trails and racing around in the desert, because you're just gonna lose a little too much of your dampening and articulation that you would want. The last thing I would talk about is bump stops. Bump stops are kind of important depending on how high end of a suspension system you go. A lot of times the more travel, especially when you get into like long travel systems, it's almost like they're a softer suspension system because they give you more travel to work with. You don't want to be bottoming out your suspension consistently and just smashing it. You're gonna break stuff if you do that. So a lot of times if you are racing in the desert and doing crazy stuff, you will put in bump stops, hydraulic bump stops or just fixed bump stops. There's a lot of different types, but you'll put in a bump stop to catch it before you bottom out your shock. It'll catch and it'll do an assist, so it'll keep it from bottoming out. Are they 100% critical? Again, it's that use case. What are you building this for? Are you trying to go be a pre-runner where you're literally going to be flying down and jumping off the ground? If you are, yeah, get bump stops, and you're probably going to need long travel, and you're going to need to do a whole lot of things, right? But if you're driving across the country and occasionally on a really rough dirt road, yeah, probably not necessary, right? So it all comes down, again, to that having a plan, building a purpose-built vehicle. What is the purpose? Your purpose is going to be different than mine. I tend to take it a little over the edge, which means I'm going to break stuff. That's the thing. That's what happens if you try to off-road and a little bit too heavy of stuff, especially in a full-size truck. You're going to break stuff. So yeah, you'll see me lean towards moving into more expensive suspension systems, but do I recommend those for everyone? I absolutely do not. Like, I do not think that every off-roader should go out there and get a triple bypass long travel system. It's just absurd. It's so unnecessary for so many reasons, right? If I did have to make a recommendation, I've built, I had a old rock crawler way back in the day. I have had Forerunners, and I've kind of had a lot of the different vehicles. I am really impressed with this Old Man Emu BP51 set. I had it on my Forerunner, and I loved it. Never had a single problem with it for years and years. They came out with it for Forerunners quite a while ago. I had it on a Tundra. Right now I have it on the Tundra, and it's an excellent kit. I did get it literally like the month that it came out, and they had a little problem with those seals that I was showing you on the rear shocks where they were leaking a little bit. Not a big deal. Able to replace that under warranty. They sent me a brand new shock with free shipping, no charge. And then I've never had problems since. So I think it was just a little bit of a kink when they first started producing the brand new Tundra ones, because I have had no issues since then. The performance on these things and the drive quality is amazing. Like the second that you switch from stock to these, you will notice such a big difference. Like even when you're stopping, especially like if you're on a grade going down a hill really fast, it's turny. The control of the vehicle, and you'll have so much less sway and dive in your nose. You just feel so much more solid. And then off-road, these things, I mean, it was essentially a shock that was designed for desert racing in Australia. So these things can handle all the bumps and washboard and everything, and you just can ride in comfort. So I really do think they're an amazing set, but they are in that mid-range price. You know, they're in the 3,000 to 4,000 range, where you're going to spend some money on a good quality shock. But like I said, if you're at the 2,000 range and then you're also thinking about getting upper control arms, well, scratch the upper control arms and get this set and replace your upper control arms later on if you ever think you actually need to. I still haven't replaced mine. I'm not probably going to replace mine until I stick a long travel kit on it someday. So yeah, check out that kit. It's an amazing kit. Anyhow, thanks for tuning in. I hope that was helpful. This is going to be part of our Overlanding for Beginners set to try to get you into your vehicle and to try to save you money. Honestly, I know it sounds dumb because it's almost like I'm trying to talk you into getting a better suspension system, but the reality is that's not the case. What we want you to be able to do is to be informed so you can go and get what you need and nothing else. Save the money. Spend the money on going places. Spend the money on good food and campgrounds with good people that you want to hang out with and that you love. That's the ultimate point here, is to get out, right? So get out as cheaply as you can, but responsibly with a good quality purpose-built vehicle. It's probably the most important point. So thanks for tuning in. Hope to talk to you guys again. See you guys again soon on a future video.